This is the DLR Cast, the essential podcast for fans of Diamond David Lee Roth. All right, folks, once again, you are listening ostensibly, almost possibly live to the DLR Cast. As always, I'm Steve, along with my good friend, the Diamond Divine and Debonair, Darren Paltrowitz. What's happening, Darren?
Indeedio, Steve.
And for those of you who are tuning in, you should know that reference.
Yes.
Or is that Indeed
yeah.
I Do or Indeedio? Indeed I, oh shit. See, now I'm already screwing up the reference. So.
Well, I think the key is thank you for listening. And it's always great to be on board with the greatest podcast listenership on the planet, right? I think we won the award for that.
Exactly. I believe this is your only, if not definitely homemade and artisanal, all natural David Lee Roth podcast. As we always say, we're fans, but we're not fanboys, bringing you the best in occasional truths, obscure facts, and a whole hell of a lot of projection.
Nothing but yeah. Nothing but yeah. I never get tired of David Lee Roth related content. And that leads me to just dig online. And lately, I've been on a roll the last week, finding all these rare European lip sync TV performances as of late. Have they been popping up in your YouTube recommendations lately?
No, surprisingly not, because I do get the occasion. I'm trying to think of the David Lee Roth stuff I get. I mean, I get a lot of Van Halen stuff that pops up. But then again, I haven't necessarily looked for obscure European lip sync. Although I did see something pop on Van Halen from like 1980 or 81 lip sync performance on Facebook this week. I can't remember what it was, but I remember that popped up, and that was unearthed or apparently recent, or I'm saying recently unearthed and uploaded.
Yeah, there was one from Italian TV like 3-4 months ago that made it around. They're like playing in front of a dinosaur in the middle of a park or a field.
Yes.
Something like. And then a week or so ago, them doing Unchained on French TV.
That was it. Yes. That was just.
And Dave has the guitar pretty much on the whole song, which is a bit of a head scratcher right there. And what was the one? There was another Italian TV one that looked like they were playing Standing Room in a club. That one just came up for me. And then there was another one today. I think YouTube's following the algorithm to know what I want. But like, where were these things all these years?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, some of those were, the two lip sync ones you mentioned from Europe, those are two relatively recent ones from this year.
Yeah.
I know that Unchained one, if that's the one I'm thinking of, just popped up on Facebook. I saw a friend share it. I think that's relatively new as far as being found on at least whoever put it up there. And they did a lot of that stuff, and especially when they were first conquering Europe, because it's easy to forget sometimes. I can't recall with the Hagar years, but or even Sharon, but there was a whole lot of the rest of the world that they should have saw more of and didn't, unlike a lot of their contemporaries that toured the rest of Europe and Japan fairly regularly. I mean, in the beginning, they certainly got out there, those first 2 or 3 records. But, I mean, I think I don't know if I don't think they played as much of Europe and UK as, like a lot of their peers, or as much as they probably could have or should have for various reasons.
Yeah, the vibe that I'm getting more and more over time is that Van Halen was huge in US, Canada, Japan, maybe Australia. I'm not getting the vibe that Van Halen was a superstar act in most of the world. Is that what you've been finding out over time?
I mean, I just think they may not have spent as much time over on the continent, so to speak. I mean, didn't they do one of the big Monsters of Rock festivals with Sammy? They did some big festivals, I think, with Dave and with Sammy, but with the exception of the early years, did they ever do the bus tour hitting? I mean, obviously they were in those markets when those videos were done in the late 70s, early, 1980 or so, but post Fair Warning, I don't know how often they got across the pond, outside of like you mentioned, Japan. We know Australia, Japan, they went to several times, but as far as the rest of Europe, I'd love for somebody to find out. Obviously we can do some digging. I'm sure there's a big tour listing out there, but I just recall it, and I can remember reading a whole lot of Kerrang and a lot of other magazines, and they played the UK, and they did some festivals, but I just don't think they were out there as often as the rest of outside of the US as often as maybe they should have, which is why maybe I suppose it's somewhat anecdotal, but I never got the vibe that they were huge superstars, like say Kiss, right?
Yeah.
In Europe, I should say.
Yeah, Kiss. I remember on the Elder tour, Kiss only did a European run and like 2 US shows, and it kind of bombed there. And then the next album, I believe, was only big in Australia. And so Kiss has always had this stronghold on Australia
and South America.
Yeah.
The last Makeup show was in South America in front of like 200,000 people.
Yes.
Right. And that was like, I guess, technically kind of, well, that was Lick It Up. That was before Lick It Up, but Creatures of the Night.
Yeah.
Which, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, they were bigger in places when they weren't big in other places for a long time, Kiss. Whereas, I mean, Van Halen had such a long meteoric, just continued huge. They were a huge attraction from 78 to 84. And then later, of course, was Sammy. So it stands to reason that they could have and should have been that big and as huge in other parts of the world. And I just think maybe that was just because they didn't get out there as much. You got to tour those places regularly too.
Yeah, this all makes me think. You remember about 15 or so years ago when bands, if they were going to be in Chicago, they had to do a day trotter session?
Yeah.
Yep. It's kind of like, oh, I'm in Kansas City. I got to do this internet radio session. You know, these localized attempts at BBC and John Peel sessions they'd have in smaller cities. It makes me wonder if all of our favorite bands in the late 70s, early 80s cut all these videos in Italy and France and all that it was kind of like, instead of just doing magazine interviews and stop-bys, they had to film these things for TV because it's like, you're here. This is your media day. 12 o'clock, go to that TV station, lip sync your album. 1 o'clock.
Well, yeah. And I totally, I mean, well, you got Top of the Pops and other things like that. So, I mean, there's a long history of that, of doing those lip sync and doing those appearances. I know Sweden had some show that was similar to that. I mean, and this is
in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I would say, probably predates the MTV era. So, yeah.
So that also gives hope that we're, as Van Halen and Dave diehards, going to keep seeing more content that we may not have known about, whether or not it's official or for the label.
Well, I'm still holding out hope that there is a Pro Shot Eat 'em and Smile tour. Well, we know there's a Pro Shot Eat 'em and Smile
we know one
show out there. We know it exists. Just never seen the light of day. I mean, and same with Skyscraper. I know there's that Japanese Skyscraper footage or something out there, but if ever there were 2 shows for Dave that should have, I mean, he would have cleaned up on the music in a music DVD with some backstage. I mean, you could totally see it with some backstage footage. And you know how so many concert videos back then would start with like that ultra fast, concentrated time lapse shot, right, of the stage being built from like the empty arena, and it right, and you see the forklift, everything's go right in a span of 90 seconds, the entire, and then the lights go down. I mean, you could totally have seen that with the Eat 'em and Smile lighting rig going up and amps and everything going in there. I mean, that lighting rig was just massive at the time. I think it set a world record, but God, what a lost opportunity. I lament it many times on this podcast.
Yeah, I they had to have been filming. Simple as that. And also in that era, you not only had the VHS market, but you had that short-lived window of Laserdisc live releases. And if Danger had a Laserdisc and TNT had a Laserdisc.
Right.
And that Hanoi Rocks Band offshoot, Demolition 23, if they had a Laserdisc, it was a David Lee Roth Laserdisc or home video in the works.
Yeah. Oh man, we should. Here's hoping, right? Here's hoping. So,
here's hoping. So, yeah. This episode's got an interview with 2 guys who know as much or more about Van Halen than we do.
Yeah, and hold on one second, because this is yet another fantastic interview. I'm not going to totally blow smoke here, but it's Brad Tolinski and Chris Gill, authors of the awesome cool, just published book, Eruption, Conversations with Eddie Van Halen. I don't mean to step on your thunder there, but I loved listening to this. And man, you've been on a roll. We've had some, let's just pat ourselves on the back here, particularly you. Listen, if you're just tuning in, go back to the last 3 or 4 episodes, because we've had some amazing interviews.
Yeah, you're too kind. The bottom line, that's sort of a skyscraper reference, sort of, the bottom line.
Yeah.
Gotta have it. That's
well,
the bottom line.
Ultimately, you and I are just 2 fools a minute. So come on.
I see what you did here. This is one of those things where there's been like 3 or 4 Eddie Van Halen centric books on the market in the last year. 2 of those other authors were speaking about getting onto the show. So when I saw, okay, a book about Eddie Van Halen, yeah, great, wonderful. Okay, conversation with Eddie Van Halen, yeah, okay. And then I looked into the authors of it and went, these are 2 top tier guitar journalists in
Guitar World magazine, guys.
Yeah, among other credits with Brad Tolinski and Chris Gill. And it's the kind of thing where at first you're like, yeah, these are published interviews. I'm sure I read these. And then when you read them on the pages of the book, you kind of go like, no, I didn't. Because let's say you picked up the guitar magazine and it's like a, 6, 7, 8 page spread on Eddie Van Halen. You put the pictures in there and you realize, wow, this only represents like 10 minutes of conversation. And between Brad and Chris, they have spent over 50 hours in the presence of Eddie with interviews. So undoubtedly there was stuff that was initially off the record, stuff that they didn't want out there. So this book is a compilation of moments from those interviews with people from Van Halen's inner circle, a lot of them after Ed had passed. Like we get a Michael Anthony interview. How many interviews does he do? Not many.
No.
There's a Noel Monk piece in there. There's Ray Daniels. I don't think I've ever seen a Ray Daniels interview before. Have you?
I never have.
Yeah. So it isn't just covering 1978 to 1984. It's not just covering 5150. This is an all-encompassing Eddie Van Halen book. And as the book alludes to, it has some interview stuff with Eddie at his low points. It has him, you're reading it and going, he's not fully there. And that's a tragic part of it. But even in that period of his life, he seems to remember everything. And my takeaway, and you'll tell me if you agree with this, because I never met Eddie Van Halen. Unfortunately, I never will get to. He's always been a mystery. But I come away from reading this as going, he's what you see is what you get, which is kind of the opposite with Dave and his.
Oh, complete opposite. Yeah. You never really get with Dave, you get the idea that that's like, that is him, right? I mean, the persona in a huge way is him. And we've heard that and read that over the years from so many interviews. But there's also another side that so many people don't see, and that is this guy who's incredibly whip smart, a better, and people know that now. I mean, the last like 10 or 15 years of interviews, it's like people know just how well read Dave is. But I don't think people know. It's rare when people, what an astute musician he is, and he has put it out there. The guy's got so many varied interests, and you got to be really smart to do that. And whether it's animation or karate or whatever. But with Eddie, I mean, what you saw was what you got. And this was a guy that no one's been more dedicated to his craft. It was a singular world for him with this thing. And exactly, that's a perfect analogy for what you see is what you get. Really incredibly intelligent, straight up on the surface. And it was all driven by an unquenchable thirst and love for music.
You also get the vibe that however he feels in that exact moment, he feels strongly to no end about that. And as you read the book, you kind of see his feelings about certain individuals and certain things over time change. And without spoiling anything, of course, some of the interviews are anti-Dave, and then towards the end he's very pro Dave, or at least he realizes what Dave brought to the table over the years, which is an interesting evolution. Now, not all of his bandmates does he say nice things about, not to throw shade at Ed, but it seems like he and Michael Anthony never made up within Ed's lifetime.
And that's a puzzlement. And I've got the book on order actually, so forgive me but that's the mystery to me, is that why the vitriol over the years to Mike? It wasn't like Mike demanded songwriting credits. It wasn't like Mike demanded a 20-minute spotlight solo.
Yeah.
I mean, and some of it, listen, we're huge Eddie fans, but he was a human being. I mean, I don't know. Were you just shocked and surprised when there was that whole thing a few years back when Eddie said, just out of the clear blue sky in some interview, that, he had a videotape him playing the bass parts for Mike?
Yeah, that one didn't take me back as badly as when a journalist, I can't remember what year this was, but it was in the 2000s, when somebody was complimenting Michael Anthony's vocal contributions to Van Halen and how he had an unbelievable range. And Eddie Van Halen knocking that as being Michael's vocals being comparable to a piccolo trumpet, where it's unbelievable range, but it's not the tone you want to hear. And you're like, what?
I just never understood where that came from, right? I mean, if the nicest guy, most straight up, down to earth guy in rock and roll, probably. Talk about what you see is what you get. And by the way, an amazingly competent bass player. The funny thing is, I was thinking about this recently, and we talked about it. And I think because I had a song come up in a playlist, and we had talked about this before, that I think the best bass guitar sound Van Halen ever got was with Wolfie, from a style standpoint, also, but from a production standpoint. A lot of times that rhythm section, and that does not knock Mike's playing at all. I just think maybe a lot of it's just recording techniques and different amps Wolfie plays, whatever it might be. But I mean, I listened to a couple of those Chicken Foot records, and Mike is amazing on it, man. You know what I mean? It's just, so to say that he's a great musician. I mean, the guy has got chops and he can play. And of course he's got a voice that's second to none. So again, I just never really understood where that whole thing came from. But let me jump on this for a minute, because I'm thrilled about this book, because over the years, always my favorite interviews, and that's with most artists in general, is the Guitar World and the guitar magazines like that, when they're talking about their craft. I mean, I know fuck all about amps and stomp pedals or whatever, and I play a little guitar myself. I mean, when they get knee deep in the weeds about, the gear and stuff, I don't know what they're talking about 99% of the time. But when they're talking about the creative process and going in the studio and how these songs came together, and they're really getting in depth about the music and the songwriting, or even how they piece together solos of different things, I eat that shit up. And so many of those Guitar World articles, I mean, especially towards the end there, I think the only interviews Eddie did for A Different Kind of Truth, Hex, when they got reunited with Dave, was with Guitar World.
I remember a Golf Digest article.
Well, there was that, yeah. But I mean, as far as regular press, you can count on one hand the number of interviews that he did from 2007 when they reformed to his death. There
was a CNN piece or clip. I don't know how long that interview was.
But as far as full-length interviews, he didn't sit down, and neither did Dave. And we've talked about this in the past too, how there was a virtual press blackout, and it was probably for a good reason. And it did help kind of the mystery of it all. I think it was an interesting marketing angle and publicity angle. But, Eddie never did do that, that 10-page Rolling Stone interview. I'm sure they got tons of requests because he had been quiet for a number of years before 2007 and was battling demons and everything. But so the only interviews he did that I recall, as far as talking about the music, were with Guitar World. Maybe Guitar Play, I'm not sure, but and I'm pretty sure Brad, if I remember correctly, Brad did a couple of those interviews, because I know he did the bulk of them, and they're fantastic, man. I got more found out who and how Eddie creates than, it'd been years. And when you go back, I think Guitar World had a special edition after Eddie's death where they had a lot of these interviews. I was like, oh my God, I forgot this interview from when he did press for 1984. I mean, or a Sammy record. And so I'm thrilled about this book, because I knew they were going to do a great job. And again, it's so in depth, and they're talking about the music, and I just love that shit.
Yeah, there's one thing that I talk about with Brad and Chris, and this you can't call it a spoiler because it's an old interview per se, but my favorite thing, which I don't remember hearing before, is that when Eddie was building 5150 at that time in LA, they didn't really like the idea of home studios and things of that nature among the city builders. So they basically gave them like a half finished blueprint or what the thing was going to look like. And they told the city that it was a racquetball court.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's how they got through the building codes and stuff like that. Yes.
Yeah. So we went into depth about that. And in general, I think it's kind of interesting in a way that you figure out quickly that Chris and Brad are not huge diehard Dave fans. And the more people that I interact with who listen to this podcast or identifies Van Halen diehards, the more you realize that a lot of people didn't care if it was Dave or Sammy singing. They were there for Eddie.
Oh, absolutely. And that's okay.
Yeah. In other words, it's not like if we make references to Your Filthy Little Mouth. If you said No Big Ting to Chris or Brad, I don't think that that's going to register per se. So it's very interesting to me here, for me to hear, like, honestly, they're not diehards. They're not pretending to be diehards. They love the Eat 'em and Smile record, but they didn't follow for years and years and years, even though they are Steve Vai friendly. They have interviewed Steve Vai. They've worked with Steve Vai on stuff. Well, that's kind of refreshing.
I've known real guitar freaks who were like, and guitar fans and really good guitar players, and that their fandom with Dave stopped at Skyscraper because it was mainly Steve Vai brought in. Okay, let's see what Dave's going to do. Whoa, we hooked up with Steve Vai. They lost the plot like so many other people did, and that's no knock on them. I mean, we were talking the last episode, the revolving cast of characters that Dave had in the band, and when it went directly, just a direct, I'm the only guy in front of the camera, solo project with Dave, right? Like an Alice Cooper or something where, Eat 'em and Smile. All the band was in the photos. He talked about the guys in the band regularly. I mean, he really put forth that this is a band project idea and talked about, the collaborative nature of it and everything. And those guys did tons of interviews around that. After that, I mean, oh, geez. Well, I mean, who knows what could happen with Jason Becker? That's just so sad. I mean, he could have been maybe that next Steve Vai guy and been there right with Dave in interviews and stuff like that. But was there ever an interview with what's his name who played on Your Filthy Little Mouth?
With Terry Kilgore?
Yeah. I remember looking for interviews. Who is this guy? He goes way back with Dave from the Pasadena days. No interviews.
Yeah. Nothing there at all. And we've seen a lot of Jason Becker interviews over the years that even when he was incapacitated, he was able to do Q&As over email with Metal Sludge and the family.
Right. Well, he's also been very prolific. He's done a lot of records.
But you raise a really good point there that the band interviews did not continue on Skyscraper as far as I know. No. And I never thought about that before. That's a really good point. The Alice Cooper comparison, where Alice Cooper was the name of the band. That was the band until 78 or 79.
But those guys were kind of faceless too. I mean, even back then it was the Alice Cooper band, but I mean, maybe there were interviews with Dennis Dunaway back then, probably, and Alice talked about, but he was the main, Dave was the main face in the band. But even from an on-stage standpoint, the spotlight that he gave to Vai and Sheehan on that first tour, and Vai also, and to a lesser degree, Matt Bissonette on Skyscraper, but that all pretty much went away after that. Obviously, those guys weren't in the band, but it was just a different vibe. It was really, this is all Dave all the time. This is a true, total, complete solo career.
Yeah, the 10 minutes or so a night that Billy Sheehan and Steve Vai would chase each other on stage without Dave on stage. I don't think that Dave was leaving the stage and letting the guitar solo so much on future tours.
I mean, I don't recall, and I don't recall. I mean, certainly when he did the co-headlining tour with Sammy Hagar and other, when I saw other tour dates through the early 2000s,
Yeah.
I mean, it was hit Van Halen hit after hit, and then Just a Gigolo. I mean, there was no solo spots or anything, to which I wasn't disappointed that there weren't solo spots, but those guys were, I knew who Ray Luzier was, but I had to do a double take. I'm like, is that Bart Walsh? Who is that? Who's on bass? I mean, they really were, they were hired hands, man. You know, I mean, it was what it was.
By the way, my nice gloves with Sammy Hagar, they're coming off in the very near future. That's just a warning right here.
No.
I love the output, but man, these PR people are. Whew.
No, we're not burning any bridges, my friend. But let's take that offline.
But yeah, Brad and Chris were such a pleasure to speak with. It's a change of pace from the previous episode where we spoke with Rocket and Kane and got that side of Dave that we haven't.
Well, yeah, and those guys played with Dave, and these guys wrote a book about Eddie Van Halen, so of which Dave is, I'm spacing on the word, and I can't even pronounce. I'm like freaking, yeah, you know what I mean. Permanently linked, intractably
associated, linked, related. But our next interview is going to get more back in the Kane and Rocket direction of things with a former sideman of Dave. So, you know, stick with us with getting a little off format for this episode.
Hey, it's Dave related, man. It's cool. I learned some things about Dave listening to this interview, and it was fun and it was cool, and highly, I will highly recommend the book, because I know a lot of the content in it without having got the book yet. It is on order. Yeah.
And as said earlier up top, a couple of other books related to Eddie and Van Halen on the release schedule as well. That Fire in the Canyon one, where they had unprecedented photo access at 5150. There's that one. There's is that one by Michael Christopher, or Michael Christopher do the other one? I think he did the other one. But the bottom line is, it's great to see people being able to dig in and open up their archives for Van Halen. I heard a rumor that there was going to be, is it Mark Weiss that had a Van Halen photo book coming out?
I think so.
I believe that's another one.
It hasn't already come out. If we missed it, have we? I would have caught that somewhere.
It was either him or Ross Halfin, one of the big three. Does anyone ever call them the big three, by the way? The Halfins, Lazauer, and Mark Weiss?
I have upstairs a big Van Halen book of up through 84. And I think, is that Lazauer? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
It's a big it's a coffee table book, and it is really cool.
Yeah. So again, it's great to see that even if things happened 30 plus years ago, there's still new perspectives on these things, and to great professionals like Brad and Chris.
Oh, Lord, yes. And you just kind of made me think of something that we started talking about before this interview a little bit, but for God's sakes, Dave just announced he's throwing in the shoes or the towel or the shirts, whatever the hell he's throwing in with retirement. Somebody's got to be working on a Dave book. Another authorized biography or something. Wasn't there the Tao of Dave several years ago? I mean,
yeah. Frank Meyer was the one who started that project. I think you have to do that old radio cliche. Friend of the show.
Friend of the show, yes.
First time, long time.
First time, long time.
Yeah, Frank started that book, and according to him, he might have said this in our interview, they took pitches. I think William Morris is pitching it, and then the Van Halen reunion happened, and the book didn't happen.
Yeah.
But there should be a book on David Lee Roth, because let's face it, all these books are about Mr. Eddie.
Yeah, and as well they should be, but Dave, there should be some good book fodder in the future, hopefully, as well. Hell, I'd read a book called David Lee Roth, The EMT Years, the New York City Journals. I even got a subtitle. Dude, I can go with this. That no one knows what the hell, right? Come on.
Yeah, there's only like the 2 or 3 stories where he talks about like saving a guy after Ozfest. But then that all bleeds into the radio Howard Stern years, which bleeds into the bluegrass strumming with the devil.
And overall, as we call that era, the David Lee Roth lost years, right? Roughly from about 93 to 2006, really. I mean, not a lot of recorded output. One really amazing record in the DLR band. And somewhere in the midst of all that, I can't go there fully, but somewhere in the midst of all that, the bizarre and twisted and utterly, I don't even know what to call it, but I still love watching it. No Holds Barbecue.
Oh, yeah. We might have the person responsible for that entire video on this podcast.
Oh,
it's been
Lord.
talked about.
I'd love to hear about that.
I also want to get to the bottom of the story about Ashley Abernathy.
Ashley,
you know
Abernathy.
What I'm talking about?
It's ringing a bell.
She was a kid who had cancer, who I believe is still with us and healthy and cancer-free 25 plus years later. But this Queens, New York charity had something to do with the fact of we get people to sing songs to help heal sick. And that's still on Spotify. You could find his
Yes,
song.
I listened to it a couple months ago. Yeah, how cool was that?
Yeah. I want to find out, how did that happen?
And how did I never hear about it at the time?
Exactly. So the lost years, he may have been recording this whole time, because some of the songs that wound up on the Diamond Dave album were the soundtrack to No Holds Barbecue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And some of the No Holds Barbecue recordings never wound up on anything whatsoever.
No, I mean, that's the thing. We should do an episode and maybe get someone on who could talk about it too, because he's done a lot of covers. I mean, Baker Street, Don't Bring Me Down by ELO in No Holds Barbecue. I mean, there's some cool stuff out there. I mean, what else is out there?
I think it's a second ELO song that he did for that same compilation.
Was it Don't Bring Me Down?
I think
right, or was it
Down and putting me on the spot here.
I'm spacing. Now I have Don't Bring Me Down in my head. I think it was something from that same album too.
It's a song that sounds like Evil Woman that's not Evil Woman, because let's face it, after you've listened to ELO for a while, all the songs kind of blend together.
No, I'm a big fan.
Me too. I saw that in Madison Square Garden.
I just had a vision in my head that if Dave was to, what do you think? And he did it all himself, so maybe this pitch meeting never happened. But can you imagine the pitch meeting for No Holds Barbecue? Wow! All right, listen, check this out. I got midgets. I got triplets. Machine guns, camouflage, a sword.
I vividly remember being home from high school that day and the UPS truck pulling up in front of my parents' house, and the doorbell ring, and the UPS truck guy hands me an envelope. He's like, "Here, thanks," and drives away. I'm like, okay. And I open it up. It was from Mitch Schneider's PR firm, and it was two hard shell black VHS tapes that just said David Lee Roth's No Hold BBQ on it. And it came with a video, it came with a cover letter on bright colored paper, because all of Mitch Schneider's PR firm things came on like lime green, startling pink, because it was brilliant.
It's like, out.
It's going to stand out from the whole pile. And it said it had some kind of a thing. Do you remember the old David Lee Roth thing in that era? Like, if you like it, tell a friend. If you don't like it, tell an enemy.
Right.
It had one of those things where it's like, we don't even know what this is. What was that? DLR.
Well, that's a crazy that's another thing I'd like to learn. I mean, it was never released commercially, but yet perhaps it was going to, because there was a publicist on it who sent out screeners and a press release on it. So, I mean, again, part of the mystery lost years.
I sent one of my 2 copies to Metal Sludge, and they never thanked me for it nor reviewed it. So throwing shade to Metal Sludge 22, 23 years for sending that one to an Indiana post office box. But I think that there's a lot to unpack with that release as well. I agree.
All right. Well, you'll hear it here eventually, one way or another. So let's get to the interview. As always, thanks for downloading and streaming. We got more great stuff coming up here at the DLR Cast.
Thanks for listening. Thank you, Steve.
All right.
The compliments and then the name drops shall begin. So, so I love your book. It's my favorite book of 2021 so far. how far we are into 2021, it's probably going to be the best book of the year. So congratulations. Not an easy book to write, to say the very least right here. But I'll start with the dumbest question, but I don't think anyone has ever answered this before. Did Eddie Van Halen like to be called Ed, Eddie, or Edward? Because I don't know.
His preference, generally when you were sitting with him and talking with him, I found was Ed, but also Edward. I mean, I think he liked Eddie the least out of all three. But Edward was really, I think, what he preferred to go by. But I think just for brevity, he just like, hey, Ed, whatever. That was cool.
Yeah, no, he sort of expressed that to me at one point, that he wasn't in love with Eddie.
Really?
He liked Ed or Edward.
Any idea where that came from? Did that come from maybe being an immigrant in a new country and they tried to Americanize him?
I think it was just dudes hanging out,
Yeah, it was SoCal, man, late 70s, dude, Eddie, whoa, shred, man, But no, I think also there was a whole thing, and David Lee Roth played a big role in this, and it was just to make the guys seem younger than they actually were at the time.
Oh.
So I think that Eddie just kind of stuck in the beginning, because it sounded young, it sounded kind of, almost teenage or whatever. So, hey, Eddie,
It was sort of interesting because when we were talking about the title of the book, Eruption, Conversations with Eddie Van Halen, I think Chris and I both suggested that it be Edward Van Halen, but the publishers felt like he was more known by Eddie than Edward or Ed. So that stuck.
Search engines. It's search engine stuff, man, because people are going to be typing in Eddie Van Halen. So they want to get those hits, maximize the hits there.
Yeah, exactly. SEO guides a lot of stuff with publishing these days. I ask all that. I like to find that out because, for example, when I interviewed Tommy Lee last year, I said, by the way, does anyone call you Tom, Thomas? Are you Tommy to everybody? Because when you think about it, when you have a 55 to 60-year-old man still as Tommy, you remember how Debbie Gibson had that period where she didn't want to be Debbie anymore. She wanted to be Deborah. And then
yeah.
So I didn't know if Eddie was like, oh, Eddie, I hate that name.
I think Eddie is like, it was convenient for him too, because it was almost a way to sort of separate his rock star persona from who he was as well. Eddie was the guy on stage, Ed was the guy at 5150 Studios.
Yeah.
I mean, the other end of this whole thing is when I had the pleasure of interviewing David Lee Roth when I was really young, which it's not a great interview, but hey, at least I got to do it when I was like 20, 21 or something
cool.
like that. He answered the phone as Diamond Dave. I didn't call him Diamond Dave. He called himself Diamond Dave. So I was always wondering, like, does he call himself Dave, David, D, that kind of thing?
Who knows? My big question is Buck Dharma of Blue Oyster Cult. His official name's Don Roser. I called and left a message at his house once. I'm like, what do I call him? Do I call him Don? Do I call him Buck? So I called him Don and he never called back. So I guess that was a mistake. I should have called him Buck, so who knows? I
think David Lee Roth prefers to be addressed as the greatest.
Yes. And Your Majesty.
I'm going to all 5 of the Vegas shows myself.
Cool.
Either of you going to one show? The reason I ask is because everyone I've spoken to so far who's worked with David Lee Roth, is a diehard fan, isn't going to one single show in Vegas.
Well, I'm not this might be controversial. I'm not a big fan of Vegas. I don't know if I would actually go there to see to see Dave, but Chris and I actually had the incredible opportunity to see Van Halen play at Cafe Wah, which was like a small club in New York City when they first reunited. And I think I was sitting about 10 feet away from Ed, on the stage. And that was sort of all I needed. Seeing Ed, Dave, Wolf, Alex that close up was pretty cool.
Tell me, This is
I was
true.
right in front of Wolfgang, so I was high-fiving him like all night. I think I was making him nervous, because it was just like, holy crap, who's this guy coming at me,
I've heard the comedian Jim Florentine speak about that show because he recorded it, and that wound up in Dave's personal archives. He just donated it to him when management reached out. And tell me if this is true. Besides that show being historic because they were playing such a small, legendary venue, especially if you're a comedy fan, the significant thing about it was Ed could not leave the stage during Dave's banter. No. He was trapped.
There was no escape. I mean, I was actually surprised how small that place was, because I've been to, I used to go in the day. I used to go to the Starwood. Not when Van Halen was playing. I was a little bit younger, but as the late 70s, early 80s happened, I went to the Starwood a lot. I went to the Whiskey a lot. And those clubs are much bigger than the Cafe Wha. The Cafe Wha is just like going in someone's basement, and so,
yeah,
but yeah,
there was no escaping. But by that time, those guys were on pretty good terms.
Yeah.
So I think that again, those that will read the book will see this trajectory, this arc from the whole ins and outs of the relationship between Ed and Dave. And sort of the nice thing was, at the end, those last several years that Ed and Dave were working together, Ed actually came to, I think, appreciate the sort of wackiness of David Lee Roth and didn't feel offended by it.
Yeah, really good point there. I was talking about this with our mutual friend, Steve Schultz. Do you know Steve by any chance, Chris?
I don't know, unfortunately.
Singer of a great band called Long Wave, another band called Hurricane Bells. Everyone likes him. He's on that.
He a brilliant guitar player too.
He's on that Tom Beaujour list of everyone likes this guy.
Yeah.
And competent. Very short list of likable and competent per se. And Steve and I were talking about this, about how Eddie seemed to, in your interviews, like everybody on the planet except Michael Anthony. Like, he unfortunately gets the brunt because, Ed was going through some tough times, to say the least, during some of the interviews in this book. But it's really cool to see how he came full circle. But my favorite part of this whole book, without spoiling too much, is the 5150 racquetball court anecdote. Wow.
Yeah. Somebody ripped that off in another book and didn't credit me for it. And it's like, I'm coming after them, man. It's like, I know where you live, so I'm going to get you. But that was a crazy interview. That was a great interview with Ed, that just, how he opened up about the whole process and the timeline and everything too. It's really fascinating. The fact that, the whole genesis of that came from, this chance meeting with Steve Vai backstage after Alan Holdsworth, after his Alan Holdsworth gig that Eddie participated in, and Vai invites him up to meet Zappa, and then Zappa invites Ed to produce his Dweezil's first solo record, the single that is, and then him and Don Landy show up at Zappa's studio and go like, why don't we do this, And that's just an amazing timeline, I think, that just how that all came together. And of course, that's just what Ed needed. I mean, maybe the rest of the band didn't need Ed to have his own studio like that, but Ed really needed that for his creativity.
Yes. You spoiled the thing. Is it a spoiler if this all happened decades ago? I don't know. It's not like Squid Games where the fourth episode. No, it's different.
Yeah, you can read the details. That's the cliff notes there. So the details are even more interesting.
For sure. That
there's so much in our book too that we can give away a few nuggets here and still have plenty left over.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, that the guy who essentially replaced Eddie as, the guitar player for David Lee Roth is responsible for 5150.
Yeah.
It was a very small world back then.
For sure. And Steve Vai, who you guys have worked with through the backstory events and interviewing for guitar magazines and whatnot, it's interesting to see how you have been cool with the guy, with Eddie, the guy who replaced Eddie in a way, the past, present, and future. You guys are those long-term people who stuck around, not the people who are trying to get the one scoop to get the next thing, to get to the next thing, you're lifers. So I guess asking Chris first, 30 years ago, did you know, hey, I'm going to still be doing this?
Well, that was kind of the game plan, really. It wasn't like I was going to do a book or anything. That was never the plan. It was just like my experience with Van Halen starts in January of 1978. KMET Radio, Rush released, when they put out that red vinyl, and they played "You Really Got Me" at 2 a.m. in the morning. And it's really funny because I found out that's Ed had probably heard that same thing, because he talked about hearing himself on the radio at 2 a.m. and running in and telling his parents, and waking him up. But I just, I had followed them like crazy because I was a guitar player back then and listened to everybody. But my thing was really to just kind of, try and be Ed's mouthpiece with the guitar community. And I was actually at a competing magazine initially, Guitar Player, when I did my first interview with Ed. But when I saw the access that Guitar World had, it's like, okay, I'm coming over there, to get in on some of that stuff, and eventually work my way up where I was, the go-to guy to go over there and do that. So between Brad and I, it was really quite a relationship we built with Ed, and it was trust. And, we never stabbed him in the back. There was times where we got kind of juicy, salacious stuff out of him, but right. Ed would have second thoughts afterwards and tell us not to print it. And if we didn't have any ethics, and if we were just thinking about, one time bang, here you go, that would have shut the door. But he was very open with us at the same time. He did give us stuff that he wouldn't give to other people because of that relationship that we had. So that was a good thing about it.
Same question for you, Brad. Did you know that you were going to be a lifer way back when?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think when I first picked up the guitar when I was 12 or 13, I had some sense that I was going to be a lifer in one sense or another, not with Van Halen, but with the instrument. And I didn't know, it's interesting that this object, this inanimate object, takes you on this journey, that has been going on for 40, 50 some years now. So we got to Guitar World, and I think for me, like, as much as interviewing Eddie Van Halen or Eric Clapton or whomever I would talk to, the idea of like this community of guitar players, right? Of all of us, which I'm sort of assuming you might be in, or an honorary member. I don't think it's like the mafia. You can't ever really leave.
I would call myself like the least competent guitar related journalist in the history, or the best mainstream person ever for the guitar world. It's kind of like the best of the worst of the best. Like
it's interesting if you're not so deep down, not in like a total virtuoso or have your thing philosophically, you can have a nice open mind towards everything.
Yeah, for sure. I like that you guys in your interviews over the years, and if I have it correct, it's over 50 hours of interviews that this was pared down from, that you can talk the gear stuff. We hear about the Dragon guitar and how different sounds happened, yet we also hear personal life stuff. We also hear how things were made on the albums. If it were a book of just 50 hours of guitar interviews, that would be a really small audience. And if it were 50 hours of just how the albums are made, also small audience. So the fact that you were able to get all of that over the case of the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, wow, that's a lot of work. It's not just, let me pause you there for 1 second, Brad. The average person that doesn't really think about how art is made would go, oh, so they just transcribed a bunch of stuff they already had. And it's not like thinking about how you told the story. You resequenced things, and then you got people to add their commentary, because you got a great, rare Michael Anthony interview in there as well. Back to you, Brad.
Yeah, and Ray Daniels, and who was the manager, and Gary Sharon. A lot of different people really opened up to us, in the book. I had a thought and I lost it. Where were we going on this thing?
Well, I think I'll speak a little bit here up to that thing is that we did have all the stuff, and we did have a lot of guitar intensive stuff. Me particular, I have
okay.
Like a marathon interview I did with Ed over at the Fender Custom Shop in Corona, California, and it was actually filmed by the professional Hollywood film crew, and it looks like a flippin' Scorsese movie. It's just these wonderful tracking shots and everything, and they didn't use any CGI on me, unfortunately, because I kind of look a little bit in my Jabba the Hutt phase there. But I've lost 100 pounds since then. But so I kind of watch that stuff and I cringe a bit. But it's it's the thing is that we did want to get to the core of Ed, and we did have this material, and that is the thing we did. I'm glad you noticed that we did resequence these things, that we put it all into a very logical timeline. You're not just reading a bunch of disparate interviews. And subjects are jumping all over the place. And you're kind of going like, wait, what was this? What was that? And it also helped us a little bit was because sometimes there were some contradictions in what Ed said.
Yes.
And sometimes you will see that in the book, but not too often. Usually when we put it in a sequence, we were able to kind of go through, and especially with time, figure out what's the more accurate answer here. Although I think I did miss one on guitar nerd stuff here, guitar nerd warning. But Ed told me when I did the deep dive into the 1984 album, that he used the Kramer 5150 guitar. That was his main guitar on that. And it's actually, I'm pretty sure that he actually still was using the Frankenstein, that Frankenstein was retired after 1984 was done. And he used the 5150 guitar on the tour after that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What I was going to say before is, you do point out a good thing. I think whether it was even in Guitar World or Guitar Aficionado or any of the books that Chris and I have worked on, it's never one thing or another. I mean, music is created by human beings, so it's a combination of who they are internally, combined with the discipline externally. And you're right. When you get these biographies of musicians, you usually get one or the other, and that's just not the right way to talk about music or a musician. You have to show how both these things work together, the emotional side with the technical side. And I think that, that was the challenge for us, was to make both of those things interesting to the novice and, the novice musician and the experienced musician. And hopefully we accomplished that. We went way out of our way to try to make that stuff clear.
Yeah. My next huge takeaway from your book, granted, I'd seen some of these interviews and pieces over the years, whether it was being plagiarized by other outlets or you pick up your guitar, but you don't when you're me, you don't really remember where you heard the thing per se. You just know you heard it, and then it's a fact ingrained in you. And reading this much Ed commentary in one place, it occurred to me he was a very what you see is what you get kind of person. There's no aphorisms per se. Whereas when you're talking to Diamond Dave, you get the it doesn't matter if you're Mickey Mouse or Frank Sinatra. You get those kinds of things. So in turn, he's good at skating around answers. I don't find, unless I'm totally wrong here, I find that Ed said exactly how he felt, and maybe it changed in 1991 from 2001, but that's how he felt in very few words.
Yeah, I mean, but the part of the idea of the book is to show him his evolution as a person and a musician. And like all of us, the 30-year-old is going to be different than the 60-year-old. You're going to go through evolution of thinking. And it's always sort of amusing to me that, people think that there is, one Ed Van Halen, or that, there's one Chris Gill. We all change over time. And the book was a little bit of a reflection of that. You do see his growth as a person. And like I said, you see parts in the book where he cannot stand David Lee Roth.
Yes.
And then by the end of the book, he's calling him a genius, so you do see this growth and this change.
And that's reflected musically too. I mean, that's the thing. And a lot of people just, they shrug off the Van Halen 3 album. And again, not to mention other books, but there's one out there and there's only 2 pages out of, about 250, 280 pages of this book, only 2 pages of them are devoted to Van Halen 3. Well, that was a very important album in Ed's history. And talking about the growth, Ed really wanted to grow. He wanted to do something mature. He didn't want to do the partying and drinking and girls and whatever type of stuff that he had done in his past. He wanted to do something that was more in line with, what he thought like Peter Gabriel was doing or something.
Yeah.
And of course that was rejected, and that just knocked him for a loop. And, we go deep into that because that's a very important part of, this beginning of this really deep, this dive that, his life went into. His life starts to unravel, and he kind of goes into this thing, and we think we're going to lose the guy, and then he pulls out of it. And to understand all of that, you have to look at that album. You have to look at that time period and understand what was really going on. You just can't brush it off in 2 pages and say like, oh, this album didn't sell well and wasn't really all that great or something, when Ed, thought it was his best work.
I mean,
Yes.
that was the interesting thing about, right, writing the book, is almost like you as a consumer of Ed's interviews through the years. I mean, Chris and I were sort of in that sort of bubble during each section too. You couldn't see quite the full picture. And I think that that's really the function of the book, is that, you might be familiar with a few of these things, but then when you step back and you see the pattern and you see the development, the growth, and that there is a trajectory and a story to the whole thing.
You make a really good point where you bring up that Van Halen 3, Ed thought that was his best work. I remember, what was the name of the show? There was a show on MTV in the late 90s where they would find the biggest fan of that band, quote unquote, biggest fan of a particular band. And then they would like hijack them basically and be like, you're about to meet this band. And I think it was called Fanatic. Do you remember the show at all?
No.
I have a vague recollection of it. Yeah.
There was a Van Halen 3 era Van Halen appearance, and they basically whisked the person away. I think we all know that it's not as simple as that, because there's talent releases and things of that nature. Like, wait, why were they filming my bedroom? Like that kind of a thing. We all know now about reality show casting and like that. Maybe there is an element of surprise per se, but it wasn't as simple as, hey, we don't know if you're working or going to school today, but we're going to put you in a limo and fly you around. It's like, I don't have a passport, that kind of a thing.
Right.
So there was a Van Halen 3 thing, and they brought him to meet the band, and he was talking about maybe how many can say one of the songs on there, Ed said something along the lines of, if one person likes this song, then I did my job. Mm-hmm. And you could tell this was a sincere thing. Like, I love this album per se, but the way that everybody shut it down over the years, I may have made a snide comment or two. It's unfair because, like you just said, Brad, the Peter Gabriel comparison, that's a thing that comes up a lot. Like, was it the Getty Museum? What was the 2015
Smithsonian?
Yes,
Smithsonian, yeah.
Smithsonian. Yeah. I think he calls out like, hey, Wolfie, what was the last album I bought? Yeah, Peter Gabriel's So.
Yeah.
Ed didn't want to write songs like Panama. He was told to write a song, as you point out in the book, that sounds like AC/DC, and he did. So It makes you think, was it true? Was he a prog guy that David Lee Roth basically edited into a pop guy as needed?
I don't think it's that simple. Ed wrote music, and it was just, he presented stuff to the band. And I mean, Ed he said he got these pop songs that just came to him, like Can't Stop Loving You, I'll Wait, Jump. These are songs that just came to him. And it's like this, sometimes he said this isn't stuff I would necessarily listen to, like he said about, Can't Stop Loving You. But he just recognized that there's potential in this. So, but I think at heart, he was a progressive guy.
I think, the takeaway from Van Halen 3 was that he, again, through the years, he kept on developing. And he just wanted to do something different. He wanted to express a different side of himself. And, the debate could be, like, as Gary Sharon says in the book, that maybe that should have been the second record with him, that they should have taken the audience a little bit more by the hand. But, that's where Ed was going. And you'd go to Ed and you'd say, well, you'd want to talk about something on Van Halen 3 or Van Halen 2 or Women and Children First or 1984. And he would go there, but he was always like a little reluctant. And his common phrase was, that's why God put your eyes on the front of your head, is to see forward, to look forward. So he was, the fans wanted the old stuff, but Ed was always looking into the future.
Right. Well, totally unrelated topic here, but Diamond Dave, we've talked about Steve Vai. I'll start with you first, Chris. Do you have a favorite of the Roth solo albums?
Oh, it's got to be the first one. I mean, that's such a raucous record, and it kind of picks up the Van Halen banner, and I don't know. I love it. I just remember that, specifically just, oh my God, Steve Vai is playing with David Lee Roth, because he did, Vai had done stuff before, obviously with Zappa, and I was aware of that. And also with Alcatraz, and it was like, yeah, but when he's there with David Lee Roth, it's like, okay, now we can really hear this guy give us the goods, and he did.
For sure. Brad, same answer for you?
Yeah, I'd say so. Skyscraper was actually not as bad of a record as some people think.
I thought it's a great record.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty hooky. I loved the songs, but it did sort of push the band in a little bit more of that pop direction. There was a little less flash than the first solo record. So I have to give the first solo record the edge, because both Sheehan and Vai and all those guys, they were sort of at the peak,
Given that there has been such acclaim in this conversation for Eat 'Em and Smile, does this mean that neither of you have heard the album in Spanish, Sonrisa Salvaje?
I have it. I actually own that. I actually went through it's not even a phase. I actually, from time to time, I collected alternate language versions of various songs. Like I have the Police singing, a bunch of their singles in like French or something like that. So I love that kind of stuff, actually.
That's how I learned how to speak Spanish.
From David Lee Roth.
From Yankee Rose, right?
All I really know how to say in Spanish is this.
The funny thing is, though, of course, what Ed says about the Japanese live album is like, I made a comment to Ed like, oh, I didn't know that, because there's in between where Dave's talking to the audience in Japanese. And I told, Ed, it's like, oh, I didn't know Dave knew how to speak Japanese. And like, Ed's like, well, yeah, I spoke to this Japanese guy and said, do you understand what he's saying? He's like, no. It's like, oh, well, good. He's good at faking it.
My favorite quick story about all of that is when I saw Dave in 2003, when he was after the Sammy tour, when he was doing some headline theater kind of stuff. There was a show here on Long Island at Westbury Music Fair, this infamous kind of venue where maybe your career's not in the best place, but you're getting really well paid. And it's in the round and all that. And I see that show and I go, this is the best show I've ever seen. This is great. 6 months later, I happened to be in Japan. Roth was playing there. So this would have been early 2004. And I see the show and I go, that is the same exact show I've seen, but it's great. And then, 6 months later, I was in Milwaukee during Summerfest. Oh, Roth is playing. This is the same exact show I've seen, but it's still pretty great. But what's significant about that is he was doing the Spanish stuff in Japan.
Wow. Cool. That really must have thrown him for a loop.
Do you think he knew he was in Japan?
I'm sorry?
Do you think he knew he was in Japan?
You know what? I honestly don't remember him saying anything in Japanese or about the fact that he was in Japan. So there's a chance, no. I mean, jet lag is not the easiest.
No.
So I've complimented you guys and your books a ton. There's so many other projects. We talked about backstory events, talked about She Rocks and all that. Let me get what's coming up next. So Chris, what's now? What's next?
Vacation. For me, Brad and I have spoken about a couple book projects, so we've got something we can't really say what's going to happen because there's very many wheels that need to be put into motion, very many gears that need to interlock and everything. But when the time is there, we will all let you know. In the meantime, I'm just playing a lot of guitar, and figuring out how to I'm actually in an Uli John Roth phase right now. So I'm listening to all those early Scorpions albums, and I'm trying to figure out Sales of Sharon,
Yes.
and that's my next thing.
Sales of Sharon, weirdly, one of the songs that connected me and my wife. I have no idea how she knew that song. I don't want to know how she knew that song, but great Scorpions deep cut there.
Yeah, and that's for me. It goes right back to those days. I actually had not heard that album. I heard Eruption, and Van Halen. The first, I heard that on the day it came out, so I bought it the second day that it was out. But I bought Taken by Force album in the cutout bin, I think for $2.99, and that was probably in like mid '78 actually already. And it was just like, oh my God, it's just like, okay, Ed blew my mind. And then I'm listening to this and it's like, I was tempted to just give up altogether on playing guitar at that point, because I'm like, I'm never going to reach this level.
Well said.
Actually, that's the project that Chris and I are doing. We're going to do the world's greatest Uli John Roth cover band.
You're only covering artists with the last name Roth.
Exactly.
We're only covering artists that we could actually outdraw by doing a tribute to the actual artist.
And it has to be not only the last name Roth, but it has to be a 3-name Roth name. So,
is there another one?
I'm sure Sammy Hagar could tell you there is. I don't know, but
we're doing the mashup. It's going to be the Uli Dave Roth band.
And then, besides your Uli John Roth ongoing tribute series, Brad, anything for you that you'd like to plug otherwise?
Actually, I have. It's probably another 3 or 4 weeks away from appearing on the internets. I'm doing a limited series podcast interviewing different artists on their favorite Jimi Hendrix song.
Wow. Okay. And seeing that the Hendrix estate is still putting out new material 51 years after he died.
Some of it quite good though,
Yeah. Hawaii
like actually
is great.
the last thing that they did, Hendrix at Maui, is really a pretty awesome show.
Yeah.
Not to go there too deep or anything, but it was one of the few shows like in 1970s where Jimmy actually seemed like he was having a good time, and he's playing his ass off on that thing. So I'm happy if the family's going to keep putting out good things, then I'm there.
Yeah, I know there's the Live France album that they're in the process of putting out as some limited edition thing. So hopefully the Van Halen family can take a note from the Hendrix family and start giving us some new stuff. That's just some personal opinions right there. You guys do not have to agree with that, but hopefully the archives will open up in the next few years.
It needs
to.
Yeah,
no, I mean, we're keeping our fingers crossed. When Chris and I went to 5150, we saw the stacks of recordings and the CDs and cassette tapes and stuff. We're hoping that they hire us to go there. And
So let me write the headline for Blabbermouth. Authors of new Eddie Van Halen book say that there's thousands of hours of unreleased material and it's coming out next year. Right?
We'll be hearing from Wolfgang's attorney for that one.
No, but thank you both for your time, and really looking forward to whatever the next project is. Whether you're talking about guitar pickups or not, I'm looking forward to it. So thank you for your time.
Well, we ain't going to be talking about love.